So I promised Brother Sam that we would try to keep it on the rails tonight. So I would appreciate your support. If there's hard questions, I will write them down. But we will jump back into James chapter 5 and recap a little bit. I had a couple of thoughts from the first few verses and then maybe get a few more. But Jeff, would you mind to start us with a word of prayer? Amen. Thank you. It is extremely condemning when you think you've done your lesson and then someone calls and says, "Can you teach the class?" And you realize that you really haven't done very much at all. And there is a great deal left to be done. So, tried to put together a few thoughts, but definitely want you to be active tonight. So as you have thoughts or questions, let's make sure and do them. I want to cover just a few things. Sam did a good job. He finished up chapter 4, and we started the first few verses of chapter 5 on Sunday. I want to touch on just a couple of additional points from James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, which I believe is a pretty contained, little paragraph in and of itself. And a couple of thoughts about that. So if somebody care to read James 5, 1 through 6, we'll review those verses as we start.
Come now, you rich, weep and howl, for your miseries are coming upon you. The riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just, and he does not resist.
Thank you. And so as Sam talked about on Sunday, who do we suppose that this little paragraph, this little contained section, verses 1 through 6, who's it written to? Best guess.
It seems like it's written as a warning against the worldly rich.
Yes. So, yeah, you get no points for saying the rich, because that's what he directly says in verse 1. But just from context, it appears that this little section is written to almost the unbelieving rich. And then if you look at verse 7, we're back on board talking about brethren. If you go back to chapter 4, in verse 11, we're very clearly talking to brethren. And then you get to this kind of section about the rich in chapter 5, and then you get back on board in chapter 5 and verse 7 talking about the brethren. So we got this little section in the first 6 verses of James talking about the unbelieving rich. And I think we made this point somewhat in last class, but just to dwell on it for a minute. Why would James spend 6 verses, right? We only get so many words in God's holy scripture. Spend 6 verses talking to people who are probably never going to read these verses, right? I mean, by definition, he's writing to unbelievers within a letter written to believers. Believers are going to read it. I agree with that. And so, why write to unbelievers in the midst of the letter to be read by believers? So verse 7, I believe, you're exactly right, Jeff. Verse 7 provides us that answer. He says, and it starts with this word that Luke and Sam have taught me to pay attention to, right? At least in my version, it starts with therefore. Therefore, brothers, and we go on, we'll talk about verses 7 through 11, therefore be patient. Well, why be patient? Why be patient in verse 7? The Lord is coming. Agreed? Yes. First 6 verses. Who do we think these rich people are oppressing? Yeah, and I think there's evidence for that. If you go back to, let me find the verse. What am I looking for? Back in chapter 2, 6 and 7. Thank you. In chapter 2, verse 6 and 7, I think we have kind of a parallel, or the Bible doing kind of commentary on itself here. James 2, 6 and 7. Remember these when we read them? Read them for me again, somebody, please.
But you have dishonored the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Do they not blaspheme that noble name by which you are called?
So, almost in an aside, James is saying, don't talk down to the poor. You treat the rich like somehow God has approved them. And meanwhile, it's these rich people that are dragging you into court and oppressing you. So he's already made that point. And so he makes it again here in chapter 5. The rich people are oppressing the poor. And I think we can learn from chapter 2 they're oppressing the poor Christians specifically. And that's what James has in mind. So, again, he's writing this section to unbelievers, and yet for the benefit of believers. Can you think of anywhere else in Scripture that happens, where entire passages or sections are written to unbelievers for the benefit of believers? Yes. So there's a very Old Testament feel here, I think. Ezekiel does this. Isaiah does this repeatedly. I'm trying to think of Nahum is written to, right? There's whole books written to unbelieving nations. I want to take just a minute. Turn back with me to the Old Testament in the book of Isaiah. And I'm just going to read the first verse of a few subsequent chapters. And notice here, remember, the book of Isaiah is written to who? Yeah, it's written to the kingdom of Israel. It's written to Israelites, written to God's people. And yet, within that book, written to believers, we have all kinds of messages to unbelievers. All right? Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 1. An oracle concerning Babylon, Isaiah 13 and verse 1. Now, there might be by coincidence or by chance some Babylonian that happened to get their hand on the scroll of Isaiah, but I'm convicted that wasn't written for the benefit of the Babylonians. What about Isaiah chapter 15 and verse 1? An oracle concerning Moab, right? Not written for the benefit of the Moabites, but written for the Israelites. Turn over one more page, chapter 17 and verse 1. An oracle concerning Damascus or Syria. All right? Chapter 23 and verse 1. An oracle concerning Tyre. Ezekiel writes to Tyre and to many of these other nations. So there's a very Old Testament feel here, that there's this section talking about the destruction that's coming on unbelievers for the sake of believers. And then, so we've already kind of made the point, why do we do this? I think one reason for sure is it is comfort to the believers. Why is it comfort to the believers? Because they have a reward that is not in the world. Be patient. That's exactly what it says in verse 7.
It's a reminder also that there is vengeance, that justice is coming.
Yes. And how is it coming? Just to answer the easy part of the question. How is it coming? Yeah. That these things are written, like, don't envy the Babylonians, don't envy the Syrians, don't envy the Moabites. Their destruction is coming. So now go to chapter 24, Isaiah 24. Verse 1. This wasn't meant to be an Isaiah survey. I think it kind of makes the point as you go through here. And then he kind of gets to the end of this section. He's talked about all these foreign kingdoms. And he gets to chapter 24, verse 1. Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate. Chapter 25, verse 1. O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name. It's comfort to the believers to know that God's still on the throne. And that these people who seem like that these nations, or in the case of James, these people who seem like that they are on top, aren't really on top. God's on top. And as long as they have that in mind, it matters. So, anyway, I just think that whole first section is interesting. Providence of God's a real thing. The Pog is a real thing. That these rich in the first 6 verses, just like Babylon, just like Syria, the God of the universe has foretold their destruction. I think there's a very Old Testament feel to that. So, the first reason is that it provides comfort to God's people. I think that perhaps there's a second reason that all those nations are written about in the Old Testament and that the rich are written about here in the first 6 verses. Can you think of a possible second reason?
Well, it may also be kind of along with that comfort, a warning to those who may be kind of like the Israelites when they left Egypt, like, well, that looks nice to not be oppressed and not be this, that, and the other. Maybe we really want to be like them. To understand that, what the goal is and what their true desire needs to be.
Yes. Completely agree. So it's comfort and it's also a warning. Look what happened to these nations. That can happen to you. Look what happens when we take our eyes off God and start putting it on things to the rich. That this can happen to you. So I think with that thought in mind, it helps me kind of put in context this passage in the first 6 verses. A couple other thoughts. Verse 3, something we didn't note, but I think is interesting. It says, your gold and silver have rusted, or John's version, I think, your gold and silver have corroded. There's something ironic about the phrase, your gold and silver have rusted. Anybody know what it is? Gold and silver don't rust. Like they literally don't rust. It is a scientific, chemistry. Gold and silver don't rust. I don't think James was ignorant of chemistry and metals. So what does that mean? Your gold and silver have corroded, and that's literally impossible. What does that mean? Yes.
It's not true. So if you got a gold ring and it rusts, that should tell you something about
Yes. Yes.
We like things in gold and silver to protect them. And the protection that they think they're going to receive from their gold and silver is not really important.
Yes. In fact, I'll tell you something very interesting about, and again, I'm not dig into Greek on every word, but that word rust or corrode, depending on what version you have, is a pretty interesting Greek word. A word that is most often translated poison, not really rust. It's the same. So there's actually 2 things that James in his letter says is poisoning you, or has poison coming from it. You remember what the other one was? So your riches are poisoning you. I think that's the first one. I think that could be a possible translation of that verse. There's one other place poison comes from in the book of James. Your tongue. James 3 and verse 8. Yeah, James 3 and verse 8, when he says, it is a restless evil full of deadly poison. That's actually the same exact word in Greek as what their silver and gold was doing to them. And so it's interesting. Why does it make sense that it says this rust will eat you like fire? Like that's odd in English. It doesn't come through, I don't think, in English in verse 3. Their corrosion will be evidence or a witness against you and will eat you like fire. I think that probably makes more sense if we read it as your gold and silver are poisoning you, and that poison is a witness and will eat your flesh like fire. I think that probably gets more at the heart of what he's getting at. So anyway, thought that was an interesting passage there. Anything else on the corrosion of their gold and silver? Thoughts about that? Okay, verse 4. Behold, this is English Standard I'm reading. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. One thing that really doesn't mean anything, but I just think it's hilarious, is we're putting a very 20th century spin on it when we say we mowed our fields, as if suddenly we've got John Deere's in the picture in first century Palestine. I don't think they were literally mowing their fields as we might think about that phrase. What were these laborers likely doing? They were harvesting. Yeah, and I think it says that on down in the bottom of the verse, the cries of the harvesters, and that should be how we think about it. So what were the rich doing to these laborers? They weren't paying. And why might they not have done that?
I think there's, just because we look at verse 7, I think there's a good likelihood that these laborers are Christians.
Yes.
And they are living faithfully to their call from God, work heartily as unto the Lord, and these are taking advantage of their goodwill.
Yes. I think that is a good summation of how we're tying these things together. Why is he writing this, again, to unbelievers, to be read by believers? God is essentially saying, I understand, I get that these people are taking advantage of you. I understand that you are not getting what you deserve. And then think about the impact of verse 7 and 8 in that context. Be patient. You talk about a time when it's hard to be patient. When you're not getting what you legally are entitled to, or lawfully or morally entitled to, then be patient. That is very difficult. So a couple of verses in that respect, and I don't think we read these on Sunday. In Malachi chapter 3, I think the issues kind of at the end of this Second Temple period are the same ones we kind of see bleeding into the first century. And we see this problem certainly happening in Malachi chapter 3 in verse 5. Somebody care to read that one?
And I will draw near to you for judgment. I will be swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely.
Stop right there. We're in a pretty bad bunch here, right? Sorcerers and those who are swearing false lies and like witchcraft and just deep evil. Okay.
And against those who oppress the wage earner in his wages, the widow and the orphan, and those who turn aside the alien and do not fear me, says the Lord.
I think we get a glimpse of how God feels about when His children aren't treated fairly in terms of their vocational labor. I think it's pretty interesting that James makes that point, and it's an Old Testament point also. As for anybody who employs someone, I think that we take these verses pretty seriously. And then all the way back in Deuteronomy, remember, we won't turn to the verse, but Deuteronomy chapter 24, and under the old law, it was against God's law to not pay that laborer the same day. That was the expectation, Deuteronomy 24:14. That was kind of the expectation that laborer was paid the same day. And so to withhold that or to make excuses why you weren't going to pay, I think that's what Malachi was talking about. And again, these were Christians who are being taken advantage of in that way by unbelievers. I think that's part of what we can see. Yes.
So, I mean, there's kind of an irony there in the idea of, especially with these Old Testament passages and, knowing, and as they well knew, the captivity that they suffered in Egypt, and, very much they have become that which they once despised.
Yes. Well said. And we'll get to verse 6. Talk about condemning and murdering the righteous one. I know there was some conversation last class. Was that talking about Jesus or was it talking about someone else? I think after study, I'd be more inclined to say that he's talking about one of the brethren in verse 7 rather than those who literally killed Jesus in any kind of sense other than kind of metaphorical. I'm not particularly staunch on that, but that would be how it would make most sense to me. So these rich who are oppressing Christians, who are withholding pay that is lawfully theirs, and in the meantime they're living how in verse 5? Luxury and self-indulgence. I read something about that word, that luxury word, as well-fed, content animals. That hits a little too close to home, I think, perhaps. But that's kind of literally what that word means. If we that in luxury is well-fed and content. And the phrase at the end of that verse, I think, is very interesting. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. Help me with that phrase. So you're well-fed and content, but not perhaps as we would think about cows and sheep, but you fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. What does that mean? There's a heart issue. I think that's a good place to start. Now I think you've left me. Fatty hearts. What are fatty hearts? What does that mean?
I think it just means their hearts are just overwhelmed with the luxuries and pleasures of the world.
Yes. Indulgent. I think to Carol's point, not operating as a heart should, but has become. It will eventually kill you. Hey, that's a pretty good. It's a pretty good spiritual parallel there. If the luxuries of the world fatten your heart, eventually that'll squeeze the faith out of you.
There's also an idea here that whenever you go and pick a cow out for this is going to be food for me for the next year, you start fattening it up, and that cow's living high on the hog. I got the best food, life is great,
Fat and happy.
and
Has no idea what's coming.
no idea what's coming.
Well said.
And I think that's maybe also an idea of what we see here. You think your life is so luxurious, you have no idea.
Yeah.
Where you're headed.
We're told to purify our hearts.
Yes.
I see this as cleaning out the heart off of the world. And what they're doing is they're fattening the heart.
Yes.
They're taking in all of the world.
And completely agree. And isn't it interesting that those who believe they are living luxuriously are the same ones in verse 1 who are weeping and howling, or at least soon will be. I think that is to Kyle's point, just fat and happy and dancing all the way to the slaughter. And I don't use that word lightly because it's actually the word that's used in the end of verse 5. In the day of slaughter, I think that, again, brings to mind that image. So, as we review those first 6 verses, again, think about what that means to the Christians that James is writing to. I think they would have some recognition that James is writing to this group, but as a way to comfort them. It's like, I see, I understand, I get it, you're being oppressed, you're being treated very, very unfairly. Like, your life is being made harder because of these who are living in luxury. And so, get to verse 7 through 11, and I'll ask the question first, and then we'll read the verses. So, will God protect us from being wronged? And what does, to summarize, what does James say to the Christians in those 4 verses? Yeah, isn't that hard? Okay, so somebody read 7 through 11 for me, please.
Do
Thank you. So two kind of overarching thoughts here, two words that James uses. In verse 7, does anyone have a different word in the beginning of that verse than be patient? I'm trying to remember other versions, they render that differently. Anything different? That's the same word that is translated a lot of other places, long-suffering. Be long-suffering. And so, if you're going to be long-suffering, how long might you have to suffer? Long. Yeah, right? That's quite literally baked into that word. And so, this is, while it is comforting to these Christians and to us, it's also kind of just a reality check that, the Disney movie, the good guy in the white hat always races in to save the day. For Christians, it just doesn't always happen, right? Like, many times it does in God's providence, and I think that He does provide us what we need, for most certainly. But God's people will be oppressed and unfairly. And there is should be no expectation or blaming God when that being free from that or resolution of that happens on earth. And James says here in very clear terms, don't expect it. Don't expect it to happen on earth. So when we say long suffering, we may have to suffer a long time. How long? Okay. Well, and that idea, that idea of patient until the coming of the Lord, do we think that was kind of do we think that's on the forefront of James' mind in this section? Note how many times he talks about or references in some way the return of the Lord, just in these 4 verses. For sure, he talks about it in the middle of verse 7. Be patient until the coming of the Lord. What about in the end of verse 8? The coming of the Lord is near. What about at the end of verse 9? The judge is standing at the door. Like, it's kind of remarkable how hard he's banging this drum for these Christians, that the coming of the Lord, the judge is at the door. So this was like 2,000 years ago. Was he just wrong? Was he misled? How can this be true, knowing, as we know, that the judge, the Lord, his return was not, as we might say, imminent? How do we square that? That's a great way to start. God's time is not our time. And so, how do we mentally square that the judge is at the door, but it may not happen in our lifetime? How do we have that, the immediacy of that may be happening, but I may have to suffer this a long time? How do we deal with that? Okay. Yeah.
Our time's not His time.
Yeah. Isn't that? I just think that's so interesting, the way James kind of, to use a word bigger than I intend to, he kind of juxtaposes those two things. The Lord's coming anytime. It's just imminent. And you may have to suffer a long time. And puts those two things together that almost seem contradictory. Did you have a comment? Yes. Yes. Well said.
That's also the reason why you know who God is. That's the reason why we can be patient long term. It calls to mind Job. Job never got an answer as to why he went through these things. He just got the mighty and powerful God in front of him saying, "Remember who I am. Remember what I've done." And James, in short form, uses the words that God used to describe himself: compassion and mercy. To throw their minds back, I would think, to Exodus.
Yes.
Remember who God is.
Yes.
That's how you do it.
Yes. So let's jump ahead there. I want to jump back, but let's jump ahead to the end of the passage in verse 11. because I think that is critical. The Lord is compassionate and merciful. And Kyle made this point. That should draw our minds back to, and I think specifically to Exodus 33, 34. And let's turn there very quickly, because this is kind of a critical section of the Old Testament. And the only reason I say it's critical is because the Old Testament writers and the Holy Spirit thought it was critical. Because it is referred to again and again and again through, as you will see, through the history of Kings and Chronicles, many times in the Psalms, through the prophets, this idea. So in Exodus 33, remember what Moses asked in verse 18. And that's the only, we'll do the short form version of this. This is like a 3-sermon series, Kyle, but we'll do the short form version of this. What did Moses ask in verse 18? Show me your glory. And the Lord said, you can paraphrase it for me. The Lord said what? I like you. I'm not going to do that. It would kill you if I were to do that. But he does allow him to see a portion, or paraphrase that the way you will, a part of his glory. And he does that. Remember the scene, puts his in the cleft of the rock and covers him with his hand. And we get to verse 34. And as the Lord passed by him in verse 6, we get this incredibly meaningful phrase. Exodus 34, verse 6. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed. And by the way, I think this is, in my judgment, this is Moses singing the glory of the Lord to the extent that he could, was this passage. And the Lord proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children. That phrase, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, you'll find that phrase repeated in Numbers chapter 14, in Nehemiah chapter 9, in Psalm chapter 86, in the book of Joel. That phrase, you'll see it repeated, I think, this is what James has in mind here in James chapter 5, calling back to that passage. You know, I want to overstate it. We're going to see the essence of what God is. I think he's telling us here in the repetition of that. And that's what James is calling them back to. The Lord is compassionate and merciful and gracious, abounding in steadfast love. So, and I think that fits perfectly with what Natalie said. This forcing you to go through this, making you suffer long, not coming back, is not from a God who's uncaring. It may very well be that the suffering long is what is required to refine us to what we need to be in order to get to something better. I think that is perhaps what James is getting at.
Think about the times in history that the humility and meekness of people who were patient
Yes.
was the instrument God used to bring a change in the world.
Yes.
And so it's, it's important to remember, as was said, it's not our time, it's God's time. And what's the purpose of that? He requires all men, desires all men to repent.
Yes. Well said.
One of the most that he said is, that many times throughout my life that time wasn't always what I had,
Yes.
but man, when it came, it's the sweetest.
Yeah.
And you appreciate it.
Yes.
That same kid who raises money for their own first product. They're going to park in mile 500 of the parking lot. Nobody's around it. And you appreciate what you have.
Yes.
And sometimes you just get someone something that's worth anything. And now they're not going to see you. Very rare that you're going to see them.
Yes. The patience required. A few more minutes. Verse 9. So, requires patience, requires suffering long, like the farmer waiting for the rains. And you also be patient, verse 8. Do not grumble against one another. So that's kind of an interesting interjection here, I think. We've been talking about, you would expect James to say, don't grumble against those who are persecuting you. Be patient, be steadfast, endure. But he puts right in the middle of here, don't grumble against one another, brethren. Help me with that. I think that's very interesting and maybe obviously intentional. What does it mean?
It's very likely that there are Christians that behave just like I said, the worldly rich, maybe the wickedly rich. There's Christians that it would be foolish to think that there weren't wealthy Christians in this day that didn't take advantage of the goodwill of their brethren.
Okay.
And so, possibly part of what he's saying here is your unity has been a huge part of how we show humility. Don't worry community because someone is wronging you. Don't go and complain to the world about what your brethren are doing. Don't show the family of God as in some sort of disarray. Let God be the judge of the matter. Let God bring vengeance in that.
Is that a New Testament idea?
Maybe.
I mean, that's 1 Corinthians 6 almost verbatim, right? Why not rather be defrauded? Why not rather suffer wrong? Go to court against brother. So that point, certainly. Jeff?
Obviously, these Christians were being oppressed here by rich people, and who of us haven't had a bad time in our life and made everyone else have a bad time around us as well?
Yeah, I appreciate Kyle's point. I hadn't thought about that one. That was the one, Jeff, that I had in mind. It's very easy in stressful situations to take it out on those who are closest to us. I wonder if perhaps that is at least a part of what James is saying here. That's a very human thing. It's a very easy thing to do. And in losing track of what's the source of the oppression? What's the source of the long suffering here? I mean, you could easily say the rich, but beyond that, even take it a step beyond that, what's the real source of the long suffering? Why are they suffering? Sin, Satan, right? That there's evil in the world, and Satan rules, the ruler of his dominion. And so, as long as we are in that context, there's going to be some suffering, and not to lose sight of, in any way, even to those who are oppressing us, much less to our brethren, to lose sight of really where that comes from. I just think you see many times stressful situations cause brethren to begin doing this, and that's what James is warning against. How did we see that happen any time recently? I mean, without putting too fine a point on it, you saw some very stressful situations where brethren started going like this. I think that kind of fits the warning that James is giving here. So why would they complain? Verse 9, they're being persecuted. It's kind of easy to lose sight in that context. And, to Jeff's point, not let that affect those around us.
We also know that James 4, he calls out there's quarrels and conflicts among them.
Yes.
And why is that? Because of their desires and their lusts. And I think we think about that in like, they have what I want, but also they're not treating me the way that I want. So I'm going to make it.
Yes. Just in the last couple of minutes that we have here, verse 10, as an example of suffering and patience. I mean, we're very clear what we're talking about here. Long suffering, suffering with patience. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. So just for a couple minutes, can we identify prophets who suffered patiently? Pick a prophet. They all suffered. I think with some varying degrees of patience, but most suffered very patiently. Think about, if you've studied Jeremiah recently, all the things that Jeremiah went through. And at the very end, he spends most of his life talking to people who have no interest in hearing him. And when kind of the final message, or one of his final messages in chapter 43, they outright call him a liar. Did Hosea suffer patiently? His whole life, the emotional wringer that Hosea was put through, Isaiah, Ezekiel, all the patient suffering. So those examples are good for us. The other, go ahead.
And the ones who endure that and who stay faithful and who stay true to God are the ones who understand and remind themselves will come about them.
Yes.
And when we see this evil in the world and we see how it affects us and we start thinking, well, I'm being mistreated, I'm being abused, we've got to remind ourselves that that is the work of Satan, because Satan is after me.
Yes.
Because he's got that person, he's got that person. He wants me. And that's how he gets me.
Well said.
Sorry, does the Bible not teach if we are Christian, we will suffer persecution? I mean, that's of some sort.
No question. No question. And verse 11, to put a point on that and to kind of end the class, we considered those who remained steadfast. Your version may say endured. You remember the steadfastness of Job. That word steadfast, I think, is very interesting. That word endure literally means to remain under. Not just be under something, but remain under something. Choosing almost in some ways to stay steadfast, to remain under the pressure of being a Christian, to remain under the challenges, not to run from them, not to fight against them, but to joyfully remain under. That's a pretty powerful word. So we'll tell Sam we got all the way to verse 11. He can take it home from there. Thanks, everybody.